90s. Some of you will remember it, many of you won't. So the way Tetris worked, it was literally a game that worked like the old Power world. It was top-down, someone else set the rules, these blocks dropped on your head, and your only job was to make everything fit into a neat and orderly line again and again and again, until eventually you collapsed under the weight of the repetition. Right? There are many organizations who are still expecting the world to operate as if people want to play Tetris. But the world is not operating like Tetris. The world is now operating like a very different game.
So Minecraft, think about how different Minecraft is. Like Tetris, it's a block-based game.
I'm not sure that's working as well as you think.
I think I should do the RuPaul Drag Race, like sachet. Maybe a sachet would be a good cue.
Instagram gold.
Yeah, Instagram gold. It's very boomerangy. So, Minecraft, right? It's a block-based game, and yet it operates so differently. There aren't rules. Everything in Minecraft is created by the users from the bottom up. People are reimagining whole worlds in Minecraft. And if you're a kid who's growing up playing Minecraft instead of Tetris, you're going to have a fundamentally different orientation toward institutions, toward what you can do and what your agency is versus what others are going to do to you. So it is engendering this really big shift, which then kind of comes up and butts up against old power. And so that's why in this next slide, we have the new power and old power
That actually did
values.
work better.
It worked better.
Yeah, the more sachet, it seems,
Sachet
is a
away.
correlation between that.
Sachet away. So this clash between old and new power values. I'll turn it to you, Henry.
So we first want to make an argument here that we are not arguing today that old power bad, new power good. What we are arguing is that we all have to reckon with the realities of old and new power, work out when to blend them together, and work out when you need to use each. So the old power world is one that we all know quite well, right? It was a world that biased professionalism, long-term affiliation, managerialism, the idea that basically institutions were in charge and people had very limited agency, a much more competitive worldview. And that clashes with what you can think of as kind of the Minecraft mindset. This set of behaviors about how the world should work that aren't premised on the world being run by institutions where you have very limited parts to play.
So, to take one example, think about transparency. So you hear this as a kind of buzzword all the time now, but it's a reality. And so young people are growing up with much more transparent lives than those of a couple of generations ahead. And, institutions face this coming to their door. So in the book, we have this expression that we use, which is that our advice to institutions and leaders is to occupy yourself before you are occupied. So there's a particularly funny example of this in the book of a US politician called Noah Dyer, who's currently running for governor of Arizona. And he decides to occupy himself. So on his campaign website, there is a section he has created called Scandal and Controversy. And in that, he basically reveals his entire sexual history, which is very colorful and interesting. And
it's actually very impressive.
It's a record of accomplishment, that's for sure. And so he sort of comes out with it. He says, I'm proud of this. It's a little unusual, but, I wish everybody else to have the same freedoms that I've enjoyed. And it's a very effective strategy in this world. And you think about the dark side of that, Donald Trump as well. I mean, that posture of just living everything out, right? There are no boundaries. More and more, that's a posture that people's norms are changing around. People are becoming much more acculturated to that kind of approach. So the world, in that sense, is changing.
And the stakes of this are very high. So if you think about an old power value that we think matters a great deal, think about expertise, right? Think about the assault on experts around the world is a very real one. And the way to respond to that isn't insisting that experts should be heard, or people to say, well, I've got my white paper, I've got my peer-reviewed research, you should pay attention to me and my 3 degrees from Caltech. That the way we need to address these problems is experts themselves need to recognize that to engage in a world of ideas where people like Aqsa Mahmood can create these amazingly powerful networks, we need those people who are on the side of Enlightenment values, the academics, the empiricists, the statisticians, the medical researchers, to get much better at spreading and sharing their ideas. Because the central argument of our book is the future is a battle for mobilization. Whoever mobilizes best is going to win. So it's especially important people like experts learn the skills of new power so that their values can win out.
Okay, so we're now going to move to a new section, which is talking about this compass. So what we then did in the book was we took organizations in our world today and we said, let's categorize them according to these two dimensions. Do you have an old power or a new power model? So is your model more like Minecraft? Does it rely on mass participation and collaboration? Or is your model more like Tetris? Does it rely on control and command? And then values. So does the organization's behavior map more to the values that we articulated on the left or on the right? Are they participatory, collaborative values, or are they values that are more competitive, more closed, more institutionalist? So let's take a tour on this compass. We'll start with the castles.
So this is where old power meets old power. And there are some obvious examples here, like the Nobel Prize. Small group of experts behind closed doors decide who the smartest people in the world are, hand out the awards unexpectedly. Old power through and through. But there are also some interesting examples like Apple. So Apple we've put here as an obviously a new technology company, but actually a very old power organization. They have a bunch of geniuses in product labs in Cupertino who decide what we all need. They drop their products down on high from these churches. We have very little engagement with Apple as a company. And also their values, they're not known to be very collaborative. They're quite a secretive company. They're quite closed up. So what that shows us is that you can still be an old power organization and take an old power strategy and be successful. But of course, we can't all be Apple.
So we then go to the cheerleaders. So these are often companies that are traditional, big companies, but they're starting to shift their approach. So the Guardian newspaper in the UK, you may know. So the Guardian is still a traditional media model. It's got expert journalists who write stuff. Our job is to read it. But it's changing. So they're starting to involve their audience in the journalism. They are asking their audience to take action around the causes that they care about. They are adopting radically transparent policies so that their readers begin to think of themselves not as readers, but as members. They are invested in the mission. It's interesting today that The Guardian now makes more money from members who kind of commit to the mission of The Guardian and take part in activities with The Guardian than they have subscribers. Just people who read the newspaper. So that's shifting. We then move up to the crowds quadrant. The crowds quadrant are interesting in that they are these more pure new power models, but there's a lot of variation in this. So in the top right, you've got Black Lives Matter, you've got Me Too. These movements are leaderful, they're radically decentralized, they don't look like institutions at all, right? But you also have big companies like Airbnb, who were very cleverly, I think, designing around these new power dynamics. So they've built a very powerful new power platform, which has challenged the hotels industry, and they've created this kind of symbiotic relationship with their hosts. So their hosts are actually now doing their lobbying for them. So when they get into a fight with a city, as they're doing all over the world, they get their hosts to go out like an army and knock on doors and campaign for them. Imagine the Hilton Hotel Group doing that. You know, you could not, right? It's impossible. So it's a very interesting example of a company that is still, you know, basically in the business of capitalism, but that is using new power. And that brings us to the kind of most interesting quadrant, I think, which is the co-opters.
And the co-opters are those companies who have new power models, but display old power values. So let's take Facebook. Facebook is perhaps the best new power machine we've seen. 2 billion users. Facebook just wouldn't exist without our participation. It's the things that we like, that we share, that we create, that powers the engine of Facebook. So it's an amazing new power model. But the values of Facebook actually aren't very new power. If you think about the way that they're governed, the algorithm makes all these decisions which shape all of our lives and our elections, and we have no insight into the algorithm. The economic value of Facebook is actually shared by a very, very small group of people. And the governance of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg has worked hard to protect himself from the fate of Steve Jobs, who was ousted from his own company. So you have this interesting world where there are a lot of companies who have these old power values but new power models. And even since we started to write about this, what's become interesting about this quadrant is there's a real pushback against the platforms who are seen to be overly extracted of the crowds they rely upon. So we think about the pushback against Uber, the delete Uber movement. We start to see the rumblings around Facebook after Cambridge Analytica. And one prediction we'd make for the 5 years ahead is actually any organization who is seeking to maintain a position in the top left is increasingly going to see its crowds turn against it.
So a question for you guys, and for those of you on the live stream, if you go to the next slide. Oh no, it's there. Yep. One back. Yep. So if we think about your world, your organizations, the organizations that you're part of, the institutions that you're part of, the platforms that you're part of. I bet you a number of people listening don't really affiliate with any institution, right? Think about where you fit on this framework, and think about where you want to be in 5 years. In the book, we even do an overlay of this framework for individual leaders. So an interesting question to ask yourself at the individual level is your own leadership style. What kinds of combinations of behaviors can you do? We actually have a quiz you can take where you can place yourself as a leader on this compass at thisisnewpower.com/quiz. All right, excellent. So we're going to now tell you a story so I'm Australian, Henry's English. So the Australians and the English have a kind of long-standing enmity, right? So this story makes Britain look ridiculous, which is why I'm really happy that we're telling it. Henry, why don't you kick off?
I'm not sure Britain needs much help looking ridiculous currently, historically, but currently things look pretty... All right, so there's this boat. The government in the UK have got $300 million, and they have got themselves a new boat, and here's a picture of it. It's an Arctic Explorer, and they think to themselves, they've recognized the world is changing. We've got this big boat, we've got $300 million to spend on it, but maybe we should involve the crowd in helping us with this boat. So here's a good idea. Let's launch a campaign called #NameOurShip. And the way you could tell this was probably not going to be a super successful mobilization campaign was they launched it with a press release. And the press release said, #NameOurShip. Today we are announcing this campaign to invite the British public to name our ship. Perhaps you would like to call it something like Endeavour or Shackleton or Adventurer. And they opened up voting for the British public.
So next slide. As you can see, this is not really how it panned out. So overwhelmingly, the British public decided to get behind the name Boaty McBoatface. Now I don't know whether that sounds as ridiculous in Portuguese as it does in English, but it's pretty ridiculous. I might add the crowd also embraced other great ideas like RRS, I like big boats and I cannot lie. It's good to know that that song made its way to the shores of Brazil. So basically, it was mayhem. This campaign actually was the biggest thing they'd ever done. Millions of people had engaged. It got international press. In many ways, it was the high watermark for public interest in maritime science in the UK. But there were some problems. So firstly, the guy who created the name Boaty McBoatface realized he'd created this big kerfuffle. So next slide. He apologizes, but then... in a very British way, he retracts his apology when the crowd turns on him. So, Henry, what happened?
So they reached this moment, which is kind of an allegory of our age, where old power is standing off against new power. The decision they have to make is you've got the new power of the nation who love Boaty McBoatface and think it's the most terrific name ever. You have the Minister for Science who is grumbling and saying this is not a serious name. We cannot spend $300 million of taxpayers' money on Boaty McBoatface. And in the end, what they do is it's quite a clever political fudge. They name the boat Sir David Attenborough, a very famous older British scientist who everyone loves. No one can complain too much about that. And they name one of the submarines on this boat Boaty McBoatface. So the sad fate of Boaty is eventually she is sunk at sea. The end of her story.
So I'm interested, guys. A show of hands in this group and on the live stream, who would have kept the name Boaty McBoatface? There we are. Okay, so there's a very mixed response. The science minister wouldn't have any of it, right? The science minister was like absolutely opposed. But it's a really interesting conundrum. And what it illustrates, if we go to the next slide, next slide again, is really, this question of what do you do, how do you use new power? When do you use old? When do you use new? How do you begin to develop a kind of a competency at this? Because this was an example of an institution that was really making a hash of it, right? Now, if your creators at YOUPIX were involved, they would have designed this initiative in a much smarter way. They would have had a crowd already on board. The whole thing would have been much more sophisticated. But institutions, not so sophisticated. There are 4 questions that we think institutions should ask, and I'm going to race through them extremely quickly. One is next slide. Do you actually need the crowd strategically? Next. Do you have legitimacy with the crowd? Next. Are you willing to give up some control or not? If you're not willing to give up any control and you're unwilling to accept a suboptimal outcome, you shouldn't do this. Fourthly, are you actually committed to doing, next slide, are you actually committed to doing something more than just a stunt? This is not episodic work. This is work that you have to cultivate over time in the long term. If you're going to build a community, if you're going to cultivate a crowd, a good YouTube creator does not make one video and then go onto TV, right? A YouTube creator is constantly feeding the agency of that crowd and building that relationship. It's a long-term commitment. So next slide.
So the stakes of all...
Skip this.
Yeah, skip this. Do you want to do some slide skipping?
Yeah, so we're going to do some slide skipping, which may require me to sashay.
Jeremy's going to sashay,
right.
which he's been looking...
All right, I've been trying to
You could just go and do this. That would be
Okay.
easier, because there's so many to skip.
Okay, all right, I'll help.
So the big question then I think becomes, if you buy this idea that there is a world of old and new power, those two things are pushing against each other, and this is, as our argument is to you, the battle from our times, then the big question is, what are the stakes of this? What are the big questions we should be asking ourselves, not simply at a local level or a leader level, but at a kind of macro and structural level? What are the big questions of our time? And we want to kind of conclude by laying out what we think are kind of 3 of the big questions that we as a community, so people who are in communities like this, should be having top of our list as we think about the future of new power.
So the first of those is, and I think is very relevant to this audience, we all exist on these platforms. But in many ways, these platforms are a bit like what we call in the book participation farms. We're the animals on the farm, and the farmers are platforms like Facebook, who are harvesting our energy, and they're creating all the value. And they're keeping us fenced in. They make it really difficult to leave the platform, right? And so we exist in this very exploitative relationship with these platforms. And the question for creators is, do you rise up? Do you change the power dynamic with these platforms? And the question for society is, how do we figure out a way to make this new power spread out more evenly so that we have a world in the future where an Uber is co-owned by Uber's drivers, where there's an algorithm for Facebook that we can all see and change as we wish, rather than have this algorithm that changes our thoughts, our feelings, our opinions, simply imposed upon us. So our call to action to this community is to really think about that in the context of Brazil. What can you do to start thinking like citizens on these platforms? And creators in particular have a lot of power in relation to these platforms, right? They are the source of the content, of the views, of the revenue. So there is a particular need, I think, for creators to take a stand in this work. And the second thing that we want to talk to you about, next slide, is what we call the platform strongman.
So one of the things that we have seen, and again, I think a particularly relevant story for Brazil right now, is all of this surge of new power has often been captured by somebody we expected to have left behind in the 20th century, which is the strongman leader. And the strongman leader today isn't operating like the strongmen of the past. If you think about Trump, for example, his promise isn't like Kim Jong-il in North Korea. He's not saying, I'm going to close everything up and make everything the same. He's succeeding because he makes things different. One of the reasons that Trump did so well is he offers the promise of a strongman as an authoritarian, but along with the promise of a strongman, he encourages people everywhere to share their own ideas, to feel their own agency, to take his message and create something more of it. So much of the Trump success was supercharged by platforms like Reddit and 4chan, where communities of people created their own content around his ideas, which spread that campaign and made it so much more intense than the campaign of Hillary Clinton. If you think about the election in Brazil this year, a lot of the conversation I know is around TV time. Who gets the most amount of TV time? But I think one of the arguments we would make is one of the big determinants in the election this year won't simply be TV time, but social media intensity. So alongside how much time you can get of the public, how much intensity can you grow from people who are really going to push hard for you when you need them to push?
And to be clear, that means, you know, candidates like Bolsonaro who are using WhatsApp, groups, Facebook very effectively to rally people because they don't have access to that TV time, to not underestimate those candidates because they exist under the radar and they're often quite dangerous. And like with Trump, I can assure you that those of us who are in America, we didn't think Trump was going to win, right? But you know, the thing we point out in the book that is so striking is that even though in the public opinion polls he was always behind Hillary and his favorable ratings were about 10 points behind Hillary, the social media sentiment analysis had him about 10 points ahead of Hillary, and his supporters were way more intense, were way more committed, were willing to spread his message, and that really made a difference and was more predictive of the outcome than the opinion polls. So we want to leave you with that. We're really excited to have a kind of a conversation with you about what this all means, particularly in the Brazilian context where we have a lot to learn. So I think we're now going to kind of end the speaking component and move to the Q&A. Thank you.
So I was taking notes like crazy, and I think you talk about a lot of important stuff. So I want to go back to the beginning of your presentation. E quem tiver perguntas aqui e no streaming também quiser jogar para a gente, é só levantar a mão, porque eu acho que isso tem que ser uma conversa e não eu fazendo perguntas. I'm just saying that if anyone wants to participate. The last thing you said about intensity, how you can, if you can make people like buy your ideas and your mission and your purpose, you can get them to do stuff for you. But I was thinking about Trump, and I think he was very, like, the call to action there was very clear. So how do you think he managed to create this open source environment for people to create memes and remixes and stuff about him, and not the opposite?
Well, it was not, in Trump's case, it was not that he planned this all out methodically. But what he did do was he understood intuitively that if he let the crowd do what they wanted, if he unleashed the crowd, he sent all of these signals to them. So there was this speech he gave where he said, if you punch a protester at one of my rallies, I will pay your legal fees. So what he wanted to do was send them the signal that they should be unleashed, that they should be creative. And so in a sense, it was the anarchy, it was the lack of structure that Trump engendered that created all of this agency. Whereas Hillary was trying to kind of give people very specific roles, but people didn't feel like they had that kind of connection to her campaign.
That's crazy. Well, we have, you talked about social, TV versus social, the political debate, and we have a candidate here which is very conservative. It's like Trump, but for Brazil. We have our Trumps here. And I was actually reading a very interesting article about how he will not be on television. He's actually refusing to be on the debates. But he has like over 300 WhatsApp groups, which are huge here in Brazil. It's actually the main like social network, but it's dark social. So he was like, I don't care about TV. I have like an invisible army here. And everybody got scared as hell, you know.
Invisible, he said.
Yeah, he said invisible army. So, yeah, I think that's pretty strong. So I wanted to talk to you about that dark social thing because what we can see on like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, we can monitor that, we can read into that. But what about the rest?
So I think that's it was interesting. Right before the last election in the US, everyone was still talking about TV time in America. I remember Jeremy was saying, no candidate will do what they should do now, which is make the same kind of investment they would make in TV and social, right? Because everyone was assuming the old rules would stay firm, and of course the old rules didn't stay firm. But the big question is, what are you asking people to do? Right? That's the big framing question, whether it's politics or business or anything else. You've got a generation of people who have been trained all day long, time and time again, to not simply consume, but to create, to be engaged in some way. If the only thing you say to people is vote for me, I mean, it's an ask, but it's not a very broad ask. And one of the really interesting things about the Hillary campaign, it was always about her and not you. It was always, I'm with her. She's ready. The whole framing was not a collective framing. So I think one of the questions with politics and in general is, what's the invitation to participate you're giving to people? And the people who give that invitation the best come out winning. And with Trump, it wasn't a formal structure. It was the informality of his campaign that made it so successful. It was the fact that he kept retweeting protesters who were pushing things in the wrong direction. He sent that signal and people grabbed it and ran. And I would predict we see some of those dynamics around your election this year.
Yeah, and it's also so fragmented, right? I get asked that a lot. So do you think Bolsonaro or Trump will win the elections, but he's not on TV? I said, well, he might, you know, because I think he understood the zeitgeist of social networks here. Like,
look, we heard Trump can't possibly win. We then heard Brexit can't possibly happen.
yeah.
I would be very nervous of making definitive statements in politics right now.
Yeah, I know. But also, when all that happened, like Cambridge Analytica was on, so after all the scandal that happened, Facebook is much more like controlling the social networks and the algorithm and stuff. So do you think like it really changed anything, or for real?
I don't think so. And I think the reason why that's the case is that the business models of these platforms lend themselves to extremism. Because people get paid for clicks. That's how the model works, right? And people don't click on kind of motherhood, bland, like,
Yeah, just
let's be really thoughtful, you know? They click on provocation, right? The kinds of hate that Bolsonaro has spewed. So I think that's a reality. So their business models, however much they try to deny it, do that. And so sure, they can expunge some of the fake stuff, but it's not the fake stuff we should be worried about. It's actually the real stuff. Yeah, and I think that's something that we shouldn't forget.
Anybody? Oh, okay.
Talking about Bolsonaro, don't you think that it has to do also with engagement of his values and ideas? That's why he has an army that's working for him, because people are engaged with his ideas and his proposals? No, I'm just asking. I'm not a Bolsonaro fan, but you know, the thing is that I see a lot of friends of mine really engaged with his ideas and with his proposals for Brazilian society. You know what I mean? So I think Trump had the same platform also.
Well, Trump essentially had a promise that the world would go back. Right, we would make America great again. It was a retrospective promise, as Bolsonaro does. So it's this interesting combination of yesterday's narratives and tomorrow's technology. And so what Trump did well too was combine those two things, that he was using all these platforms to promise that the world would roll back and be as it used to be. And one very dangerous combination we see in the world right now is this combination between authoritarianism and participation. Right? So if you think about anyone who can promise more order and more agency, so things will be more ordered and you'll feel more agency, is going somewhere, is making some progress in politics, and you only need to look to China. So look at China right now. China is obviously becoming a much more kind of ordered state, a much more authoritarian state. But at the same time, it's a highly participatory state. People are engaged on social media all the time, forming groups, entrepreneurialism, culture, commerce. They're just not forming meetups around politics. And so the interesting combination as we look forward is how the platform and the state actually start to feed each other. And I think we should be very worried about that.
Can I do one more? One more. Well, I'm from the old power generation. I'm 58. And I worked the last 30 years of my life at BBDO Network, which is an advertising network. Yeah? And we used to say to our clients that you can use any kind of technology, but if you don't have a great idea, nothing will work. What do you think about that?
Well, I'd argue that if you don't, the new version of that story is if you don't have a community who can have great ideas for you, right? The difference is that premise was you hire some advertising genius, the great copywriter who gets the perfect phrase, and they create that perfect phrase and everyone around the world knows it. It's interesting, at Cannes this year, the big winners weren't the geniuses, it was people who did activation. So the whole shift in the advertising world right now is a shift towards your job isn't to have one genius behind closed doors. Your job is to work out how to find the genius in everyone and let them tell your stories for you.
Yeah. Well, I think the point that we make in the book is that if you finish an idea, if there's nothing you can do with that idea, people are not going to be interested. We have this concept in the book for business we talk about called the participation premium, which is when you ask people to do something, you might intuitively think that that makes it less appealing to someone. But we show business after business, when they involve their consumers, even when the consumers are actually doing their work for them in some cases, they will actually pay more for the ability to be involved. And so there's a dynamic there that is being played out in a lot of different ways. And again, the creator culture does this very well. You know, the relationship that creators create with their fans is very much one based on participation and interaction.
Alguma outra pergunta? I wanted to talk more about communications because I think here in Brazil we have a very specific scenario with media. We have a huge television media company called Global, and actually most of the audience and most of the money still goes to Global. So we're here talking about new ways of collaboration and organizations and stuff, but half of Brazilians are online. So how do you deal with, like, sometimes I feel like I'm living in a bubble, you know, so you're there in São Paulo and that means nothing, you know, like internet people just stay there with their memes and stuff. I don't know if you get that. If you feel like that.
Totally. Yeah, there's a big disconnect between those living in that new power world and those living in the old power world. I think the key thing is actually for the new power crowd like you guys, you need to like figure out how to kind of integrate. So in other words, you can't just operate in your bubble. If you're going to change the world, you're going to have to change Globo, you know, or upend Globo. Right? So you need to think in those terms rather than just operate like that. In the book, the kind of recipe for effectiveness that we really lay out are the organizations who can combine old power and new power to get what they want. And we hope that progressive organizations like yours will do that, you know, rather than just stay pure.
But like the old model is not bad. I mean, you just said a lot, like if you can mix both the old model and the new model. So how can the old model fit into this new model and fit well?
So I think it's very hard for institutions to change, but there's a couple of things which can really work. We've seen work very well. One is institutions often, successful institutions who've been successful for a long time, they'll hire some young person, like some 24-year-old who used to work at Snapchat. And this person will come in and say, I'm going to disrupt everything. It's going to be different. You guys don't know what you're doing. And they'll make everyone feel like they're irrelevant. They'll come in and they'll make everyone feel like they don't have a role. And actually, those people are very rarely successful with that kind of disruption agenda. What we see much more effectively is people who have a lot of credibility in the old power world who start to change their behavior. And by doing that, they influence the behavior of others. And we call that character the shapeshifter, right? Someone who shifts. And even someone like the Pope, you think about the Pope, right? In the ultimate old power organization, think about the way in which he as a leader is actually shifting the way the church is moving, in some ways, and obviously not moving enough in other areas. But if you think about the work he's doing, he's sending this very powerful signal about what leadership is. It's not fancy. It's not up on a dais. He was in a Skoda last week in Ireland. He's got an even worse car. Now he's downgraded from the Peugeot. So he has this very powerful signal about participation. He's made the church much flatter, right? It's much closer to its parishes. He did a survey of the laity for the first time, and he shaped the whole narrative of the church. He's tried to push it away from all of these hot button issues towards this kind of narrative around mercy. So you can see in a very big example like that, the power of someone near the top of the institution who has credibility in the old power world to lead the shift, I think a lot about that as you think about companies.
Yeah, I was thinking about the graph that you showed about the cheerleaders, right? I think for us, like YOUPIX, we're more like the cheerleaders, but sometimes it gets you get tired of just like cheering and yay, because the actually it's not just about, you have like the business model and the participation model, right? So, but okay, the participation is great, we're all collaborative, etc. But what about the business model? Because it is still very old. Right. So yeah, it's pretty cool to do this and creators and stuff, but really like opening my heart to you when cheerleading sucks sometimes, you know.
Right.
So how do you equilibrate that, you know?
We totally understand that, and I think that the struggle is that even if you want to build something big today, even if your model is new power, ultimately you're still subject to these bigger systems that are very old power. So you think about why Mark Zuckerberg, you know, and Facebook has turned out the way it has. Partly it's because he owes all of this money to these investors. I mean, he is completely in their service. So there isn't a way right now to dramatically scale something if you need billions of dollars of capital without being part of this system that demands shareholder value. So there's this question of what can we do to reimagine the system itself? And I think some of these crowd equity models offer some promise. Some of these blockchain models offer some promise. But we are going to need to change the superstructure around which these different things live if we really want people to move from cheerleaders to this kind of top right quadrant.
How do you feel about blockchain? Do you have bitcoins? Or we had a YOUPIX talk like 2 months ago about blockchain and its impact on media, so that's why I'm asking you.
You'll notice that as soon as the difficult blockchain question got asked, Jeremy gave me the microphone. Very, very quickly.
How do you feel about it's for Jeremy the question?
So all right. So here's the there's a very hopeful answer there. So blockchain, there is a very hopeful answer, which is that the kind of distributed technology might lend itself to new power in some very meaningful ways. If we can disintermediate a lot of middlemen, if we can work out a way we really can scale trust globally, there's a reason there is so much hype around the blockchain. There's a great deal of hope. There's a great deal of hype around the blockchain. On the other hand, I always think that we've heard this movie before. The World Wide Web was going to democratize everything, and everyone was going to be disintermediated, and everything was going to be fair. Of course, that isn't how this played out. The blockchain is kind of promised that it's going to be incorruptible, but I've always thought that the blockchain is to incorruptible as the Titanic was to unsinkable. Right? It's unlikely, but we see time and time again already with Bitcoin, you see the dangers of what's done on top of the platform. So I think we should see a lot of hope, but don't believe the hype.
Okay, so sell your Bitcoins, guys. Questions, anyone? Tem questions da internet? Nosso amigo da BBDO, so you can ask again. So it's going to be you, me, and them here.
Curious about that newspaper in England, The Guardian, that you said that the readers became more active and participating. In which ways? Can you example us?
So there's actually an even more interesting newspaper in the Netherlands, which The Guardian has followed some of their work, called The Correspondent. And they have recently given all of their readers the opportunity to create expertise profiles. So imagine that everyone in this room could put together a profile about the things that you know about, the things that you've learned about, the work that you've done. And then any of the journalists, let's say that 4 people in this room have expertise in security issues. The journalist can then engage with their readers before the piece is even posted to ask them for insight, to get information, to get ideas, to get comments on the articles. Then when the articles are published, you have these army of people who have worked with you on the story who then take the article out into the world and support it and share it. And so that's just one example of actually how journalism itself can become much more participatory. And then for The Guardian now has the biggest database of police killings of people in the US, which is put together by their readers. So if you're reading The Guardian, you're adding to this database of police killings, you're supporting it on a monthly basis because you think it's a philanthropic good, you're signing petitions on the website, you're suddenly taking on a role which is so much more than simply buy my newspaper. And it's that shift, I think, as a metaphor that organizations need to get their heads around.
How do you see some initiatives from places of the unconnected world, like Africa, how they managed to, having this vacuum of old power business models like bank and financial system, they invented this network kind of mobile finance system. How do you see that as a spearheading of new trends for the connected world?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're referring to platforms like M-Pesa, which have been very effective. I mean, look, I think there's lots of reasons for hope there, because some of the institutions, the intermediaries never got built in Africa, and there was a leapfrog effect with the mobile phone becoming prolific. You do have a lot more peer-to-peer activity happening than you might in even a place like Brazil, where, you know, the banks are very strong here and they're very, like, you know, you can't get around them, right? Whereas, you know, in a place like Africa, there's a lot of that peer-to-peer financial transacting. So I think that's exciting. I also think that, again, the difference between, you know, people in poor countries now compared to 30 years ago is that they can see exactly how people in rich countries live, or well-off people in middle-income countries, right? Because the reality of countries like Brazil is really two countries, you know. And so they see that. They see it clearly. And they are not going to just lie back and accept an unequal, unfair, unjust world. So that, I think, is heartening, but there'll be many obstacles in their way.
What makes your heart feel warm in this connected world? Like, for example, this example in Africa. What are other things around the world you're seeing that are like perfect models of all this new power shifting? In Brazil, do you have any? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think things like you know, participatory budgeting, which of course began in Brazil, where people are actually engaged in the budgeting. See, those kinds of things are very promising, and I think we point towards Taiwan is looking very interesting right now. There's a lot of work going on inside government there to actually reimagine government, to make it more participatory, so the experience of government on a day-to-day basis is better, because so often the experience of government we have is basically horrific, with occasional elections. And so the question becomes, how do we do that better? Taiwan is doing that well. The Netherlands has become like new power paradise, that virtually every system you come across, which is kind of exciting in the new power world, is in the Netherlands. So we're quite excited.
But is
there.
it like too much sometimes, or no?
No, I think it's interesting that actually there's a lot of experiment going on there. There's also a kind of collective culture which is helpful. And then I think you see things like, I think we see things like Iceland has actually been a country where, again, because they've done so well with digital, they've then naturally done quite well with kind of new power models. But here's the thing, I think, to give us all quite some hope. Anywhere you look around the world, you're beginning to see people who are on the right side of history starting to experiment with some of these new power models. You're seeing doctors, you're seeing nurses, you're seeing health workers, you're seeing scientists, you're seeing journalists. There's another kind of hidden army out there. One hidden army is all the crazies getting behind some authoritarians. The other hidden army is good-natured people who want to build a just society, who are starting to experiment with new power. So the thing I think we see most of all, the thing we talk about all the time is kind of Trump and Uber and Facebook. The thing we see, which is most heartening, is everyday people suddenly making themselves and other people near them more powerful. And the cumulative effect of that laddering up is perhaps the thing we're most hopeful of all about.
But do you think sometimes like our ego or our human aspect will get in the middle of that? Do you think we'll like eventually will be like in the top right position like the whole world, or do we still need like the old model of human beings, not like business, but like to have opposites, so you know you're good, because if you don't have the bad, how do you know you're doing good? You know, like
I don't think we've never based this work on the idea that humans are somehow perfect or that new power makes them more perfect, right? I think we all recognize anything which starts off as very utopian often then doesn't end up that way because human nature kicks in. But one insight, I think, there's a psychologist called Marilyn Brewer who had a really important insight, which I think kind of points towards the human question of our times. And she has this theory called optimal distinctiveness. And optimal distinctiveness is the idea that if you want to have a perfectly functioning group, everyone in the group has to feel two things. They have to feel just the right amount of the same and just the right amount of different at the same time. So you think about YOUPIX, it works because everyone feels just the same right amount of the same. They're all part of the same community. They share a set of values. But in that community, everyone gets to stand out in their own way. So as you think about human dynamics of the work that you're all doing, one question I ask every day in my work is, how do the people I'm working with feel the same? And how do they also feel different? And if we can get that balance right, I think we can feed the human need for ego, and we can feed the social need for stronger societies.
But how do you balance that? Just one last question.
Well, how do you do it?
Yeah, to keep everybody.
I think well, I think a lot of it is culture rather than tools. I think one of the biggest dangers with this is we always try and create kind of technologies that will make humans better, which I think often what you actually need is what's the culture which surrounds some of these products and platforms. And again, one of the things which you guys do well is you have a kind of culture which surrounds this, right? It's not because you've got a good website, right? It's because you've got a good culture which surrounds the technology. So the melding of that technology and that humanity seems to me the secret sauce. I'll let Jeremy, this is a very hard question.
It's a pretty hard question.
Yeah, terrific. Jeremy would love to answer this question.
I'm really interested in climate change as an issue, and I follow it very closely. And all of this is fascinating what you guys have said tonight, and thank you for that. And it's made me think even harder about this question. But what you see, one of the things I see on, say, Twitter, are the scientists, the expertise you talk about, and it's a really complicated subject. Climate change, for you to really understand, to really know the research, you have to be a climate scientist. You have to be sort of, I mean, it's really, it involves a lot of dedication and really hard scientific questions that you have to, you have to know the research. And they're always trying to get us on their side. And it seems like a hard battle that they're not really winning. And I wondered if you could just reflect on that, and have you thought about that? Have you witnessed that?
Yeah, well, it's really a great note to end on, because I think you're right. Climate change is such a good example. The stakes of that work are so high, and yet the climate scientists who know so much about this, who are speaking the truth, are losing a battle in many ways to those deniers, because those deniers are using new power. They are unbound by fact, by reason. So that's the work. It's interesting that actually in Brazil, the organization I'm part of, Purpose, is focused here on climate change, because we see so many opportunities, on that issue to break through in new ways. But in order to do that, it's not enough just to be right. And that's why we wrote the book. We wrote the book because we wrote the book with the climate scientist in mind, in fact. We really did. We talk about this all the time. We talk about the climate scientist who reads the book and actually is emboldened to be more effective at spreading, her message around the world, and be more and not be kind of a purist about that. So that's why we actually wrote this book for experts that are really important in this increasingly fact-free world. But that's why we want to make sure this book ends up in the right hands. We want to make sure that people who are fighting the good fight get to these tools before ISIS does, before the climate deniers do, and before the Bolsonaro fans do, in all frankness. So there we are. We've laid out very clearly where we stand in the Brazilian election.
While we are here, sorry, enquanto a gente está, depois eu traduzo. Enquanto a gente está aqui, o Bolsonaro está lá no Jornal Nacional, com a colinha Brasil, Family and God in your hand.
She was saying that while we're here, Bolsonaro is on television with the notes and tips on his hands, reading like God, family, in Brazil, on Globo. Jornal Nacional is like the biggest, like CNN here in Brazil. So I was actually going to ask, well, you answered him, but he did not ask you why you wrote this book. What is, you know, like really, we talk a lot about why, how, and what here in Brazil. We're late, I know, but I think it's important, like exponential organizations, all the massive transformative purpose, etc. So it's a great book. But what's your purpose, guys? Like, what do you want? Not the Bolsonaro fans to read it. Okay, I got it. But what else is behind it?
Well, I'll start and I'll let Henry finish. I think our dream is that in 5 years' time, there are people all over the world teaching each other these new power principles, because we think these principles are really important to all the things we care about. And so it isn't going to be Henry and I teaching them in 5 years' time, but it's going to be someone who attended this talk, having a conversation in their community, you know, in their group. We want to see it fan out to all of the different issues in which we need these issues to play out. In Brazil, there are really important issues of race, of corruption, of climate change that are playing out every day. And in each of those issues, they have new power applications. So that's our hope. And so we hope that some of you today will pick these ideas up and come back to us and will certainly help in any way getting the word out and help you kind of share these ideas with the communities that you care about.
So last question, that I know you guys are tired. If you could like tell people just one thing they can start tomorrow to lead this change, what would it be? Like very doable, something very simple. What is the simplest step to this? Buy the book, okay.
Buy the book. Now we're talking.
Well, yeah, BBDO, right?
The perfect new power answer is buy the book, then share it. That's the dream. Here's the truth of it. I don't think there's one simple thing you can do. And I think we should all be very cautious of a world that promises us one simple thing is going to make a difference. Time and time again we say, just give me one takeaway so I can do something tomorrow. The problems we face in this world are not going to be solved by simplicity. They're not going to be solved. We all wake up tomorrow and do one thing and suddenly, hey presto, the world's better. The world's going to get better when we do thousands of complicated things, not one simple thing. So I think as we begin this work, I would think of it not as what's my quick fix I get tomorrow morning, but what's my journey ahead? How day after month after year can I individually and collectively add my dent to a world that gets a little bit better? And that's the reason we wrote the book.
Wow. So I hope this was like the kickoff to everyone's journey here. Thanks for coming. Thanks for you guys on the internet. So keep the dream alive. And thanks so much, guys. And please, can you autograph my book?